Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced. The best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. Hello and welcome back to Season 3, believe it or not, Season 3 of The Thermostat with Jason Barger. So glad that you're back. Thank you wherever you are right now in the world. Thank you for listening and welcome back to the podcast after a brief break. Welcome and excited to kick off Season 3 of the podcast. 2020, the year 2020 has been a very strange and crazy world so far. As we all know, it's been strange. Certainly everything that's been happening with the global pandemic, with civil unrest, with so much happening economically, politically, everything in the world right now. It has certainly been a strange, disorienting, unsettling, certainly scary, but also hopeful in some ways, and undoubtedly it has been a time to step back and to listen, to learn, to think, to plan, to just be, and certainly to grow. So these are historical times, and I'm excited for what is to come on this podcast, because during these historical times, in the coming season, the messages, the conversations, the nuggets of thought-provoking stuff that hopefully continues to add value to the journey of your life and your career during these historical times, I think this is going to be a great place to be. I hope that you are as excited as I am. So much great feedback has come in around seasons 1 and 2 of the podcast. So much great feedback, positive mojo and vibes from season 1 and 2. So I thank you for everybody who's gone out of their way to share some quick words of wisdom or feedback or just some positive messages to me. They've been amazing interviews back in seasons 1 and 2. Voices that so lucky and excited to join and to share and to have joined me on this pod. And there have also been other micro pods. I've been really loving the micro pod kind of schedule with messages that have stimulated many. And I'm so glad again to hear that from so many of you out there. But hopefully nudging us all forward. These micro pods and messages that nudge us forward, help us wherever it is in this crazy world, helping us navigate our way through it and think about how we show up in our own lives and as leaders, but also how we shape the culture of the teams and the groups and the people that we work with throughout our organizations every single day. So I'm excited to kick off another new year together. If, again, I invite you to go back and listen to season 1 and 2 and hear those episodes whenever you have a moment, but excited to kick off season 3. As always, my hope is that these podcasts give you something to think about each week, something that engages your mind and your heart, and then also it leads to intentional action. So, season 3's here. Keep listening, and thank you to everybody who listens, who shares, who rates the podcast. If you can leave a review, all of those things just help amplify these messages further in the world. So if you're willing to take a minute to rate the podcast and review it and share it with other people, that helps amplify it and just helps the messages reach even further out into the world. So without further ado, let's kick off season 1. I have been reflecting a lot lately on the difference between a journey and a trip. The difference between a journey and a trip. I love trips. Let me be clear about that. I love trips. I love traveling. I love isolated episodic, jumping into something, a new place and a new space and time. They're often restful. They provide a new landscape. So I love trips, but the reality is it's limited by just time and space, that we have isolated trips that we take. So I love trips and I love traveling and new experiences. But for me, they mean more and have more depth when they aren't isolated experiences, but are a part of a larger landscape, the journey of my life and the ongoing learning that I'm having. So I love those isolated trips, but more importantly, I love stepping back and thinking about how each of the trips are actually a part of a greater landscape, a greater journey of my own life, my own learning, the experiences that I'm having. And so I see it that all of them are actually connected in so many ways. And so different than a trip, a journey is longer lasting. It is connected to a series of experiences where one place and time connects, builds upon, and is contrasted from where you've come from and also where you're heading. A journey is about the experience as a whole rather than just the individual stops along the way. I cherish the individual stops, and we have to make sure that in a time and space where we have to be able to slow ourselves down and cherish the moment and the time and being in the present moment. I cherish those individual stops, but it's helpful for me in this instantaneous world that we live in today. It helps me to actually step back and appreciate the context, the bigger picture of the journey of my life, my experiences. And we know this not only for our own individual, like literally traveling throughout the world and the journeys that we're on, but we also know that for the journey that we're on in our lives, with our families, with our friends, and certainly with the teams and organizations, the careers that we're leading. That it's not about an individual isolated trip, but it is about a journey where we are developing, growing. Each experience builds upon another, and we are a part of a journey of developing ourselves and the experience that we're having over time. With all that has been happening in the world, we need to remember all that's been happening in the world. Again, global pandemic, civil unrest, economic challenges, political challenges, so much divisive energy in the world. We need to remember that we're on a journey. We're not on an isolated trip. And in fact, we're on this journey. We're on this marathon that's not a sprint. In our personal lives and in our development, and certainly with the teams and organizations that we serve, they're not just isolated experiences. They're a part of a larger journey together. And so many of the teams and organizations that I've been working with, as I think about just the last few months of this global pandemic, the last few months, especially back starting in March, many of the teams and organizations that I serve and support in helping them with their leadership development and the culture that they're shaping, clarity around mission, vision, and values, that I'm connected to their leadership teams and throughout their organizations of helping them. I think back in just a few months ago in March when the global pandemic was beginning. And so many of the teams and organizations that I watched and worked with and supported or just observed from a distance, that they came out of the gates just firing on all cylinders as this new virus came into the world where people didn't know what it was. They came out of the cannon, the leadership teams. And I talk about the fact that leadership is revealed. In times of crisis, leadership is revealed. And so many of the teams and organizations responded so admirably during these times. Not perfectly, and of course there are examples out there of people who didn't respond well, but the teams and organizations that I've been working with and observing, so many of them came out of the gates, and especially at the beginning, embracing this global pandemic and responded so admirably as a leadership team and as an organization. Their communication was strong. the spirit of caring for people, for quickly identifying, to stepping back and adjusting and trying to make sense of this virus they didn't understand, but identifying new protocols. They were working extra hours, long hours. They were needing to be so detail specific. And at the same time, they're trying to make sense every single day of the new information that was coming. And so many of these teams and organizations, starting in March, they came out and the sprint was on. They were out of the gates, and this what seemed at the time as maybe an isolated trip, they came sprinting out of the gates, and again, pretty admirably. But I've also noticed lately, with many of these examples, in many recent facilitated sessions that I've done with these leadership teams or with these companies, organizations, these same groups that came out and have risen to the occasion so admirably, that I've also noticed, and I even said to many of them recently, that they're tired. You can see in their eyes, you can see in their voices, you can see in their vitality, their engagement, their just body language, that you can tell they're tired. And rightfully so, they are, because so much has happened in the last few months that has been challenging to our minds, to our nerves, to our anxiety, and to the quick pace that we are asked to run. So it's just now kicking in that we're on a journey and not just a trip. That this, in fact, this global pandemic, which many people back in March and as we came out of the gates, I think had in their minds that by 4th of July, this was going to be behind us, and now have realized that this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. That this global pandemic and the ripples that is causing politically and economically and certainly, again, with all of the civil unrest and opportunities that exist in the world right now to implement change, we're realizing that this is a marathon, not a sprint. This is a journey, not an isolated trip. And so many of these leaders, teams, and organizations are needing to make time to step back, to catch their breath, and make sure that they're positioned and aligned and moving forward for this next stretch of the journey. Andy Politz is a guy that I've met. He's actually from my hometown of Columbus, Ohio, and he's been on many expeditions to climb Mount Everest, many expeditions in his past. He's got amazing stories talking about these expeditions, climbing Mount Everest, and so few people have done that, but he's been a part of many of these missions. And I remember a story that he told me way back when, and it stuck with me all of these years. But he talks about when you get up on Everest, when you get up to a certain elevation on Everest, it requires you to take 4 breaths of oxygen because the oxygen levels are so low, the air is so thin. It requires you to take 4 breaths to do anything. And so he tells the story of waking up at like 3 a.m. in his tent and having to take 4 breaths. Sit up. Took 4 breaths just to sit up. 4 breaths, tie his shoe. 4 breaths, tie his other shoe. 4 breaths, get up, stand up. And he goes on and on explaining that they had to get up so early in the night because it takes them so long to accomplish anything. But they need to take 4 breaths before they can take the next action. That image has stayed with me all these years because different times in my life when certainly things, the sickness of both my parents and certainly the years in which watching them both pass away and the challenges and that came with that image of knowing that there are times in our lives when we need to take 4 breaths before we just take a step. 4 breaths and identify and intentionally take the next step. And that sometimes there are times in our lives along the journey that require us to take those 4 breaths before taking a step. And so recently, with many of these teams and organizations thinking about the journey that we've been on and the pressure and the anxiety that is built around this global pandemic and everything happening in the world, I've reminded them that the best in the world need to make time and space to step back, to breathe, to make sure that they're intentionally taking care of themselves, that they are staying aligned to that longer-term mission and vision, that they as individuals but also as teams are committed to the daily culture that they are creating, and that they're connected to those 6 A's of leading change. If you haven't listened to that podcast, go back and look, when I talk about the process of leading change and shaping culture, it all follows the 6A process that I do with teams and organizations. But we have to, in the midst of times that are disorienting and challenging and that we're trying to navigate our way through it as individuals and as teams, we need to make sure that we're making time to step back, to breathe, to make sure our mindset is clear and healthy, and then make sure that we're taking time to align with the people around us on that longer-term mission, that vision for where we're trying to go, and our commitment daily together to the culture that we're trying to create and the change that we're trying to lead. So more important than ever, that this time we've come out of the gates and certainly came out strong, but now have reached this point in this global pandemic where it's not over, and we're realizing it's not an isolated trip, but it's a journey. We're realizing that we're not in the midst of a sprint, we're in the midst of a marathon. And so more important than ever, we need to stay connected. We need to be prepared for not just a trip, but for a journey that we're going to go on together and be committed to showing up and challenging each other, walking with each other, supporting one another, caring for one another, and continuing to shift our eyes back to what's the next breath or the 4 breaths we need to take, and what's the next step that we need to take together. So I want to leave, as always, with a couple of questions to ponder for this podcast. How do you need to catch your breath wherever you might be in your own individual life or your work and your career or on the team and organization that you serve? How do you need to catch your breath right now and refocus your energy in order to navigate whatever lies ahead of you? How do you need to catch your breath and refocus for yourself personally? How do you need to do that with your team? And are you making space and time to connect and navigate their way through as a team? I know in many of the virtual chats that I've been doing with teams and organizations that they realized they weren't making time to catch their breath and refocus as a team. Are you preparing yourself and others for a journey, or are you only preparing for an isolated trip? What conversations that are the currency for change are needed in your life and with the team and organization that you work with every single day? Remember, every journey begins with a single step, but we got to make sure that we create time and space to breathe and then to move forward together. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to your organization, or you have a question or comment about this podcast, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we all are ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of,
The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.